long days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a Doof Media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series and beyond. I am your host, Constant Reader Scott Daly, and I'm joined, as always, by the man with moxie. And I don't mean the soda. It's Matt Freeman. How's it going today, Matt?
Well, what do you mean?
It's moxie.
What does that mean, though?
It's like,
What is moxie?
It's like,
does anyone know?
Yeah, man, you got moxie, kid. Yeah.
Nobody knows. Nobody knows what it means.
Because it's a made-up word, apparently named after a soda.
That's just amazing to me.
This week on the show, it is new book week as we enter our penultimate decade of season 3 and also of existence on Earth, I guess, technically.
Yeah, true.
at least presently, right?
Yeah,
right?
True. Yep.
We are setting our sights on King's 2012 novel 11/22/63. This week we introduce the novel and read from the prologue all the way through chapter 4, essentially covering all of part 1, Watershed Moment. Matt, what did you think of our first reading of 11/22/63?
Well, so far covering this book has been a watershed moment for us.
God damn it.
Don't worry, that's the last time I'm going to make that joke.
I'm sure. I'm absolutely sure.
I mean, it's very fun so far. I love, the conceit we're setting up, the way that we're playing with this idea. There's a lot of really interesting stuff going on with the characters, but it's very subtle. That's what I'm really appreciating with this book is the subtlety and sort of deliberateness with which we're setting up the ideas and the characters. And then I can only assume we're going to put these ideas and characters into play in ways that are going to be just incredibly effective. But so far, I'm really enjoying this slow burn of a setup.
That is great to hear. I loved it too. This was a joy of a read for me, and I can't wait. This is actually, the second time I've read this book, as we have moved into basically the present. We're now in a decade that's only 14 years ago, technically. I just haven't had as much time to read all these books multiple times, so this is only a second read for me, and I'm pretty excited about it.
Well, that's cool.
Before we get into the decade and the book and the chapters, though, we do have a couple of quick announcements. Matt, what is our first announcement?
First announcement is just to remind everyone about Kingslingers Live, our live show happening in mid-June, the weekend of June 14th through 16th, 2024, in case you happen to be listening to this in the far future.
Oh gosh, what if someone showed up? What if someone's in 2027 and shows up in Maine? Like, where are you guys?
Yeah, just wanted to clarify that. I mean, especially talking about time travel as we are, you got to be real specific.
Oh yeah,
People can get confused if they're coming back in time to go to the Kingslingers live show and they came to like 2021 or something, and people were like, "I don't know what you're talking about."
That would be really embarrassing.
Would be embarrassing for everyone involved. So you can head on over to doofmedia.com/Kingslingers Live to check out the details of that. And there's still some tickets left for the live show. So
yeah, we still have like 36 seats left for the live show. So plenty of tickets left, and it's going to be great. It's going to be awesome. Matt and I had a meeting last week, kind of starting to build what the live show is going to be. And we're pretty excited about it.
Absolutely.
One more quick announcement. If you are a patron of Doof Media, now is the time to go check out Patreon, because we have a new episode of our series Castle Talk, taking a look at Stephen King's adaptation of sorts on Hulu called Castle Rock. This month we looked at episodes 7 and 8 of the first season, which features one of the best episodes of television ever. I can say that boldly without any backup, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. It's one of my favorite episodes of TV for sure, and a really, really great episode. And we had a really great discussion. So if you haven't checked that out yet, now is the time. And if you aren't a patron and are wondering when is a good time to join, right now. We're almost all the way through Castle Rock, the first season at least. And we also have a bunch of other bonus podcasts on there for you. So check out patreon.com/doofmedia and join us for some great talks about castles.
That's right.
We should pivot Castle Talk after we finish to just be you and I discussing various castles around the world.
I think that would make a lot of sense for everyone involved. Yeah, let's do it.
All right, let's get into it, Matt. Let's talk about the 2010s, the penultimate decade. That makes it sound really ominous, but the way things are going, you never know.
Yeah, it's like when
2000.
It's like when you ask Alexa how many minutes left, and she's like 4, and you're like,
"Oh God,
so what?" Yeah, what?
Wait, does that really happen?
No. I mean, if you ask her how many minutes left, she'll tell you, but only on the timer that you're doing.
Oh well, yeah, okay,
yeah, right.
It's a little different, Matt.
It is.
2010, Matt, was only 14 years ago. Dear God, how is it already 14 years? That's ridiculous. And the 2010s, I think I've said this every time that it's an interesting decade for King, because they all are. That's why we're doing this. But, we talked about the 2000s as they were like dominated by the aftermath of King's accident that happened in 1991, his scramble to finish The Dark Tower, and the several books, Duma Key included, dealing with the fallout of that accident. And so with that in mind, we look at the 2010s and we're like, okay, so what is like the theme of this decade? And I think here it's less obvious, but I do think there is one. King is now in his 60s. Actually, he will turn 70 near the end of this decade. In 2017, he turned 70 years old, which is, by the way, Matt, the same age as our old pal Ralph Roberts. So he has officially achieved Ralph Roberts' age.
Awesome.
So he's kind of an old man now, right? I mean, I would like to think that 70. By the time I'm 70, I'm not going to think 70 is old, but I think you can call 70 old officially, right?
I think so. I think even by our modern standards, where 60 is the new 50 and so forth, I think 70 still crosses the line. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah. So King wrote in this decade 11 novels, including The Wind Through the Keyhole, Joyland, Dr. Sleep, Mr. Mercedes, Revival, Finders Keepers, End of Watch, The Outsider, Elevation, The Institute, and of course the novel we selected for this decade, 11/22/63. He also co-wrote 2 additional novels, Gwendy's Button Box with Richard Chismar and Sleeping Beauties with his son Owen King. On top of that, 2 more short story collections were added to the list. The first, Full Dark No Stars, came out in 2010, and The Bazaar of Bad Dreams came out in 2015. So despite being in his 60s and 70s, this dude has not slowed down at all.
Not at all. It's interesting. For whatever it's worth, I feel like there's less cultural penetration of these titles that you just listed. I have no real sense of what these books are about, whereas I have quite a lot of knowledge of previous decades just because of the adaptations, right?
Yeah.
So, and this isn't meant as a knock on the books. I think it's literally just like the culture has expanded over the last 20 years. There's just a million times more stuff coming out. People weren't making as many adaptations of King's stuff. And so I'm sure there's a lot of gems buried in here that there's just not as broad a cultural awareness of because just the vagaries of history, I guess, which is, appropriate for this conversation.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Certainly. Had you, was 11/22/63 a book that had kind of risen in the cultural consciousness enough for you to be aware of its existence before all of this?
I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think that I knew that there was a book where King wrote about a guy trying to stop the JFK assassination prior to our starting this project.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think I kind of agree with you. It's one that, people don't, I feel like non-constant readers don't know about as much, but it is like, unlike Duma Key, this is not an underrated King book. This is a properly rated King book. People really love this novel. And so you would think maybe it would have more reach than that. I mean, they did make a Hulu original series about it starring James Franco that, by the way, we are going to cover once we finish the book, but it's not on Hulu anymore because the streaming industry is horrible. They took it. Okay. They took the Hulu original series 11/22/63 off Hulu. So now to watch it, you have to like rent it on Amazon Prime for money, which is dumb.
Hilarious.
I hate it.
Yeah, that makes no sense at all, but okay. I'm excited to watch it though. Yeah.
Yeah, we're definitely going to watch it. We're going to cover it at the end of the novel. So if you haven't seen it yet, that's just a heads up for everyone. If you were planning on jumping on Hulu at the end of the novel and watching it, well, you can't anymore because there goes my plans. It was literally like last week that this happened, by the way. Just perfect timing. Thank you, Hulu.
So should I be imagining Jake as the actors whose name you just said 5 seconds ago?
Franco?
James Franco, yes.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if you want to, you certainly can.
Okay.
Jake's tall. Jake's 6'4".
Yeah.
How tall is Franco? I don't know.
Not 6'4", yeah.
He's 5'11". He's tiny. I mean, compared to 6'4".
Yes, compared to 6'4".
Yeah. All right. Anyway, so what is the theme of the decade, right? Well, I mean, one of the things we notice immediately is this is kind of the introduction of King's foray into crime fiction as he starts and completes the Bill Hodges trilogy. Also introduces Holly Gibney, who King absolutely loves and has written about multiple times this decade and the next. And we'll be covering that whole thing separately. We will be reading a crime fiction story. We're going to be reading Mr. Mercedes. But what else do we see? The thing that I noticed when I looked at this decade is this recurring element of returning to the past. And obviously that's literal in the book we're reading, but you look at Dr. Sleep, King revisits one of his original novels. The Wind Through the Keyhole, King revisits the Dark Tower characters once again, and currently for the final time. 11/26/63 is obvious. It's literally about returning to the past, but it's more than that. This, Matt, I don't know if you knew this, is a book idea that King originally had in the 70s that he shelved for various reasons, including just inability to do the research that he felt was necessary to tell the story right. He returns to it here now in his later years. The same is true for Revival, an idea King had as a young man that he chose to come back to in his 60s. Under the Dome is a book that technically didn't come out in this decade. It came out in 2009, but same deal. It was an idea he had much younger, an idea for a book, and he put it away. He threw it in the trunk, I guess, and he waited until now to make it happen. King's The Institute is less obvious, but it features the return of the shop from Firestarter, although I don't think they refer to it as the shop in this novel. It's the Institute, but it's the same general concept. So like there is this overarching theme of looking back, of picking up old ideas and old things and considering them that's happening here in this decade.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, obviously, like you said, very apropos to be talking about this book about time travel and going back to the past in a decade where he seemed to be very concerned with the past.
Yeah.
It's also interesting to me to hear that he, resuscitated this idea from an idea he had when he was a much younger man.
Yeah.
Because it seems obvious that the idea must have changed quite a bit, because if he had written it in the 70s, then it almost by necessity would have been about a character who was directly impacted by the JFK assassination, whereas it seems to me to be a very central part of the story, actually, that our main character in this story, was not first person subject to the JFK assassination. It was not a super important part of his life, right? I think we'll talk about that as we get into it, but it seems like the shape of the idea must have changed over time for that to be true.
I completely agree, and especially the idea that this is a book about returning to years and years in the past, and so it is a book kind of about nostalgia. It is about looking at this bygone era and being attracted to it in some interesting, weird way. And I think King is commenting on a lot of these things, and that couldn't have been in the original story either, right? If you're in 1973 heading back to 1963, like it's just different. And you could see maybe like the thread of, oh, this is the 60s comes to an end, the hope, the dream of the 60s comes to an end, and here's a guy at the very end of it going back and re-experiencing that, and how that would be different from a person from 2012 doing it. But still, I think so much of what makes this book interesting to me is the fact that we're a person in 2011, 2012, returning to an era, decades and decades removed.
Yeah, absolutely. And it feels like, I mean, I have a lot to say about the tone of the story and how, we read a lot of science fiction. We read a lot of time travel
Mhm.
stories. For whatever reason, we read a lot of time travel stories. We read a disproportionate amount of time travel stories over on the book
Yeah.
club.
Yeah.
And usually those stories have this tone of sort of like maximalist approach to like, okay, we're gonna do all of the things we can possibly do with this time travel idea. And it's interesting because so far our characters have a very minimalist approach.
Yeah.
And I don't know
Right.
if that's going to remain true or not, but it's just an interesting change of pace for how the novel is starting thus far.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's one of the most fascinating things about this book is it is kind of a high concept story, right? This is a book about time travel, essentially. It's a book about a guy going back in time to try to save JFK from being assassinated. But it's also an 850-page book, and so the question you might be asking yourself, and all of our first time readers might be asking yourself, which by the way, we got a huge response from people saying that they were reading this book for the first time with us, which is very exciting and very cool. I'm so happy for all of y'all. I'm a little jealous as well. This is a great book to experience for the first time. But yeah, I think that's a fair question of like, what are we going to do for 1,000 pages in this thing? And I think you're starting to see maybe what we're going to do. Just the idea that he's going to go back to 58, not 63, and he's going to have 5 years in the past. And what is that going to look like? And how is that going to shape the story? And how is it going to reveal what the story is actually about? That's part of what I love about this book so much.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainties at this point. I mean, I'm sure we'll get into it as we go, but like, imagine, I'm almost sure. This is just a guess, I guess. I guess I'll say it that way. Like a guess is that um, he may have to try more than once. He may
Hmm.
make it 5 years in, and something goes horribly wrong, and he can't stop this, and he has to try again. He has to start over and go through the same 5 years again.
Sure.
Um, which again, like, this is kind of what I mean about like we're so used to reading time travel stories where it's like almost frantic and fast paced, and people trying to like one up each other in this game of chess, and it's like the time scale here is so stretched out that I think that's kind of the active ingredient of what we're doing with this premise,
Yeah.
is
Hmm.
is things being slower on a longer time scale.
Yeah. I like that. I like that.
Cool.
So as far as like the answer to the question, why did I pick this one? Much less complicated than Doom Key or Desperation. This is a masterpiece. I think this is one of my favorite King books. I think it's easily a top 5 King book. I think it is. It is really interesting to look at a career of a man who I, I generally loved his books in the 80s and 90s the most. And so you could say, oh well, he's lost a step. He's fallen off, and then he comes out with a book like this, and it's just like no, he still got it. Here it is. It's all right here. And it's just I think like hyperbole maybe a little bit, but I think it is just one of the best novels of the 21st century so far. I really do. I think this is just a brilliant book by a master storyteller, and of course I picked it. Of course I did.
That's awesome. I'm so glad, and I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, yeah. I think I briefly wanted to talk about the Kennedy assassination as we move into the book here, though. Like, I think to put it in context, or people that might not understand it, like this was like the boomers 9/11, right? Or perhaps more accurately, it's right to say that 9/11 was our JFK, right?
Mhm.
My parents were born in 1957, so they were really too young to understand the assassination. But my mother has 4 older brothers, and like is ranging from a few years older to like a decade plus older than her. And I just remember having conversations with them, like listening to them talk and relive and remember and reminisce about what it was like to be alive on the day that Kennedy was assassinated. The book describes it as a watershed moment, right? A thing on which the gears of history turn sharply. And so it makes sense that like for King, was exactly that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just to remind everyone, including remind myself, because I forget this, Stephen King was born in 1947. So he would be like 16
Yep.
when JFK assassination happened, which, so first of all, he'd be very much able to understand and feel the impact of that event.
Yeah.
And also, I just think it's, I don't know, ironic or whatever, that you and I were pretty much 16 when 9/11 happened.
Yeah, exactly. I was exactly 16. Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
I guess technically I was about to turn 16, but close enough.
yeah, I was close enough, right? That was a very formative event upon my worldview. That was a traumatic event, right?
Yeah.
Even though it had nothing to do with me personally, it was still, deeply upsetting.
Yeah.
And so I can sort of imagine carrying that with me, and wanting to. I mean, you could just as easily imagine a book about preventing 9/11
Oh
with time
yeah.
travel, right? Like I'm almost surprised that book doesn't exist, right?
I feel like it will eventually. Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like it probably does actually. Now that now that I've said that out loud, it probably does exist, and it's just not very good. But
Hmm.
who knows? Anyway, yeah. So understand. I understand the impetus for writing a story like this. Is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, just like, one of the things we talked about with Hearts in Atlantis was King, wrote in that book about kind of the failure of the promise of the 60s, right? That like the 60s was this time of this great turbulence and change in the country, and how and that generation's kind of overarching disappointment that none of the promise of that was fully realized and fulfilled, that we just kind of went back to a lot of like the people of the 60s got old and became just people, became boomers, and and so looking at like this kind of desire to change that like here's an event that could possibly change that, I think is understandably evocative for a person of Stephen King's age.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, let's do it. Let's get into the book itself. Matt, we got some quotes here at the very beginning. 3 very interesting quotes, I think. The first is by Norman Mailer. It is a quote just about the Kennedy assassination itself. It is virtually not how do you pronounce that word?
Assimilable.
Assimilable to our reason that a small, lonely man felled a giant in the midst of his limousines, his legions, his throng, and his security. If such a non-entity destroyed the leader of the most powerful nation on earth, then a world of disproportion engulfs us, and we live in a universe that is absurd. I mean, that's a great way of like contextualizing the insanity of that event, right? Like just it's a perfect Mailer quote that just says, this is why this was such a huge deal.
Yeah.
It recontextualized the feeling of safety we had. And again, I think 9/11 is a perfect parallel for our generation, right? That's what did it to us. Like you and I were fortunate enough to not be directly affected by any of the deaths in 9/11, but it still like changed how we thought about the world.
Yeah. I was just thinking that there's a difference, which is that 9/11 was a conspiracy. It was part of a sort of ideological machine, whereas
Mhm.
as far as this book is concerned, at least so far, JFK assassination was just one shitty little guy who
Yeah,
had a rifle and a bad attitude, and like
that almost
there's
makes it scarier, right?
right, yeah, exactly. Like that's the thing, is it's like, well, you can, like, I always thought it was interesting that America as an entity, like all of us, became like incredibly bloodthirsty and irrational after 9/11, and it was because like we felt like we could get our pound of flesh. We felt like
Mhm.
we could get something approximating justice. But when it's just this one guy,
Yeah.
you can't get like it's like, what are you going to do? You can kill the guy, but
Yeah,
it's like that
and
doesn't
he did. Like we caught him
yeah,
right away, and then he
right.
was assassinated, and then yeah, who do you blame at that
Yeah.
point?
It doesn't feel like justice. It just feels like the universe is, just like Mailer says here, absurd.
Yeah, yeah.
There's no proportion. Exactly.
I
So
think that is ultimately why there are so many conspiracy theories around this thing. Is this desperate need to find greater purpose out of this event than just one dude decided he didn't like this guy and wanted to kill him. Um,
right.
like that has to be right. Like I mean, I know we just like humans love conspiracy theories, especially especially these days, but like it just makes so much logical sense that the need for there to be a greater plot, a greater story, a greater meaning here.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I've never gotten into JFK conspiracy theories.
Yeah, me neither.
Neither do I like dismiss the possibility out of hand that there was something else going on other than just Oswald, but I don't know that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that regardless. I think
Nah.
for the sake of discussing the book, we're going to confine ourselves to like what seems to be happening within the book. But yeah, like you said, I see why there's a felt need
Yeah.
to find some kind of meaning here. Yeah.
The second quote though is interesting. So the quote is, "If there is love, smallpox scars are as pretty as dimples." And that like is one where you're like, okay. Like if you're going into this book for the first time, you know it's about the JFK assassination. You read a Norman Mailer quote about the JFK assassination, you're like, okay, I gotcha. I'm with you. And then you read the next quote and you're like, wait, what are we doing here? What does that mean? What are we talking about?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he's got his ex-wife. That's the closest thing we have to anything relating to love, right, in the
Sure. Yeah.
story. And maybe that'll take a more central role. I have no strong predictions in this space.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't quite know what to make of that yet.
Yeah, the idea that love, I mean, the idea being posed here is that love makes the quote unquote ugly, beautiful. That love allows you to see past that these kind of things, and that's a great idea. But what does it have to do with the assassination of John F. Kennedy?
Well, so I do have a bit of an idea, I should say. Okay. So thematically, I think we're in the next literal 10 minutes we're going to talk about an instance of like a character who something horrible happened to, and he kind of managed to be okay about it. He managed to accept it and move on with his life. Mm-hmm. And I think what we're kind of saying is like, smallpox scars is very specific. It's like you get a illness and it scars you, but that doesn't mean that you're damned, right? Like,
yeah,
like you can still be loved, just even though you have these scars. And that's an approach to life, is just like, yeah, bad things will happen and you can't unhappen them. Mm-hmm. But you can choose how to react to them. And here we have a story where, well, you can unhappen things.
But should you?
Or what does it mean that you can do that? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. I like that idea that, like this idea that those things are part of you. There's like, you could say that the JFK assassination is a smallpox scar on the country.
Yeah.
Right. If you want to.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I like that. Yeah. The final quote here is uncredited. It just says dancing is life. So, I mean, we like dancing.
Yeah. Stephen King. It is interesting.
Yeah, I guess so.
We've done 1 million of these books at this point, literally 1 million. And I don't remember him ever having an uncredited epigraph quote thing here.
Yeah. I mean, so it just has to be Stephen King.
Yeah, right. I mean, what else, right?
Yeah. All right, Matt, let's move into the prologue. The first line of this book is, "I have never been what you'd call a crying man." So this is how we are introduced to Jake Epping, writer, high school English teacher, and resident of Maine circa 2011. One of the things, Matt, starting off here, I find really fascinating about this book is how it is indeed part of the tried and true King formula, right? We have a writer, we have he lives in Maine, he's a white dude, and also there's some magical element that exists in the world. That is the King formula for the most part. And one thing I want you and our new readers to pay attention to as we go through this book is how he takes that basic starting element of a King story and tells what I think personally ends up being a very different kind of book for King. It's still distinctly a Stephen King book. I don't think you're going to be reading this book and forget you're reading a Stephen King book, but it is a different sort of story. I don't know. What do you think of that?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. I think it's interesting because like Epping, this character, he's kind of like Jack Torrance in a few ways. He's kind of like a young Stephen King in a few ways. He's super tall white guy, but I think that there's also distinctions. There's like a sub archetype of the Stephen King archetype where it's like he's more of a failed writer than he is a writer, and he's working as an English teacher, which is something that Stephen King did. But then Stephen King moved on to being a novelist. Mm-hmm. And so it's like this is a particular side of King that he's interested in. Yeah. And this story is like the side of King where he is. I don't know. Maybe it speaks about regret, or roads not taken, which would be both of which would be appropriate for a story about time travel, right? Where it's like
Hmm.
there, but for the grace of God go I. Well, what if I could do it differently? And so it's I think that's my feeling so far. And then also just like it's a slower paced story. I
Yeah.
feel like it's spending a lot of time on setup. Like we're through the whole first week's reading, and I don't know. I was gonna say not much has happened. That's not really true, right? He did go
But
on his
none of it.
first.
But none of it is the overarching plot of the book, right? Like
Yeah,
we're almost 100 pages into the book, and he's just now going back to 58 at the end of this week's reading, not even to begin the work of saving JFK, but to perform another experiment to prove that is even possible.
right.
And so that experiment could go on for who knows how long. And so yeah, we're definitely slow rolling the plot, I
Yeah,
think.
and I was gonna note something just about this prologue, and
Sure.
in terms of things being slow paced, is like this is a really unusual prologue for King. This prologue is not really located anywhere in space or in time.
Hmm.
It is almost just like a personal letter from the character to the notional reader. uh like nothing's happening while he's telling us this, and King doesn't usually do this. He might embed this kind of information in the stream of consciousness of a character
Yeah.
as something is happening to them. As Eddie Dean is sitting in the airplane, he might be ruminating over the recent history, but this is literally just Jake is talking to us.
Yeah.
That's what the prologue is, and that just feels very different. It feels very uh, uh like thoughtful, and yeah, ruminative, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, and as you know, I'm famously not a fan of prologues. I
Mhm.
generally think you should just not have them, and then put all the stuff that you want to say in the prologue into the log, just
Right.
the book. This one does work for me though, and I think it's for exactly what you said. There is this feels like, all right, I'm presenting the story to you. I'm not gonna pump this prologue full of information that should just be in the story proper. But here's what I'm gonna just say. I'm gonna be like, look, okay, I'm about to get started, but here, let me have a chat with you first. This is what the story is actually about. This is what matters to me, actually. And I think that is really interesting because one of the big things to point out in this prologue, Matt, is this is not there's John F. Kennedy does not appear in this prologue at all. There is
Yeah.
nothing in this prologue about JFK. And that is important. And we'll get to that in a minute, but I think that's one of the reasons why it works for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to modify what I just said. I said like nothing is happening here. It's like, well, he does tell us the story of the time when he read um the essay, right? But
Hmm.
it's like,
Hmm.
okay, but where is he telling this story from is really what I meant. Like we
Yeah.
don't know when or where we are in terms of like who's telling us this. It's like, well, it's Jake, but it's Jake, like Jake in what context, right?
Right. That's a good point because Jake in the chapters proper, like it is, and maybe I'm just wrong about this, and I'll need to pay attention to this next week when I'm reading. It doesn't seem like in the chapters proper, Jake is like looking back on the story and reminiscing on the events of the book proper. But in the prologue, he definitely is, right? Like in the prologue, it's definitely like this was the moment that led to everything. This was it. In the actual chapters, it seems like he's just relaying the events that happened to him as they're happening.
I agree. I have not seen any indication that this is one of those like little did I know that later
Yeah,
I would, type
yeah,
things.
sure, yeah. I mean, we'll pay attention to that. Maybe it'll contradict us almost immediately, but worth thinking about for sure.
Yeah.
One of the things I did want to point out that is established early in the prologue here is that Jake's wife, Chrissy, is a recovering alcoholic. I think that's interesting because King has written a lot about addiction and his main central characters being addicts, but I think it's much rarer for him to write about being the spouse or partner of an addict, right?
I agree. I can't think of a good example off the top of my head. I think normally, King makes the main character into the addict,
Yeah.
and we end up feeling sympathy toward the main character, because it's hard not to feel sympathy toward the POV. That's just kind of how stories work. So it might be interesting actually to have a character, an external to the POV character who is the addict. Of course, at this point, we don't know. In fact, I think we have reason to suspect that his ex-wife will not be a significant, a character, but she may very well be. Like, we don't quite know the shape of how things are going to play out. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I keep thinking about like themes of regret and roads not taken, and awareness that like, this man seems to be like, he's holding it together well, but he's kind of a sad, lonely man in some ways.
Yeah.
And perhaps thinking like, man, if only things had been different, and now he has the power to potentially change things for himself, not just world historically, but perhaps, improve his own life by changing the past. Right.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think one thing I noticed though this time, and maybe you'll disagree with me on this, is kind of how laissez-faire he seems about Chrissy. Like, he just seems like kind of resigned to what happened.
Yeah.
And it's just like when he talks about her, like I thought something that was really interesting is when he talks about her alcoholism, it almost comes from a place of inconvenience and annoyance to him. Like when Chrissy was getting back from rehab, and I think later he talks about he needed a drink after his conversation with Al, and is like, oh, thank God I can have alcohol in the house again.
Yeah.
And I don't think these things are meant to be like mean to alcoholics. I think this comes from almost this self-conscious part of King that is very aware of how his addiction and his struggles have affected the people around him, the people that he spends his life with. And like writing from the point of view of one of those people, he can kind of take out his anger and disappointment at himself, or I guess in this case his past self, with that kind of reflection. Is like, I know like no one that loves me would ever say this about me, but I know it's like kind of annoying, right? It's kind of annoying that like if I want to drink at the end of the day, I can't have one because we can't have alcohol in the house, or that time you were in rehab, and that's really honestly was inconvenient for me, but I will never say that out loud. But he can voice that through these characters.
I kind of love that, because he was just talking. I was just reading on writing where he's talking about the need to dispel this romanticism about alcoholism, and I think this is a great way of doing that, where it's just like there's nothing cool about this. It's just like it was a pain in the ass that I had to deal with this, and I couldn't have alcohol in the house. This is ridiculous. And yeah, I agree in the overall sense that like it doesn't seem like they had a mad love affair of a marriage. It seems like it's more just like, now I'm a middle-aged divorced guy, and that's kind of childless divorced guy, and that's kind of a bummer, but not like, I'm pining for the lost Chrissy, and like that doesn't seem to be any of that.
He doesn't seem to care. He really doesn't. I mean, he's sad about it, but he's resigned to it. And there's no like, it doesn't like, you're absolutely right. There's no indication, like there's no any moment in any of this where he thinks, oh, time travel, perhaps there's a way of saving my marriage. And I know that's ridiculous with the 1958, but still, like, it doesn't even occur to him.
Right. Well, that's one thing I was, it's like, I think it's a natural thought to have, though. Like, even if it is ridiculous, I think it would be a thought that would cross your mind, is you'd be like, shit, there's got to be some way that I can enrich myself out of this. Like that's like that's the premise of like every time travel thing, is like, how do I solve my personal problems with the magical time travel?
Yeah.
And by putting it, over 50 years prior, it does make it more difficult to do clever things, but not impossible. You could still enrich yourself. I don't want to get ahead of us, but like, one of the interesting things about the story to me is how subtle Al has been. It's like, and he's like, you got to be careful. You don't want to get attention. And I'm like, man, every other science fiction story we've ever read, the person would have like made themselves into a world conquering billionaire like immediately. But like that's not Al's attitude, and that's seemingly not Jake's either. I mean, we haven't really seen what Jake's going to do with it yet, but doesn't seem like he's gonna, like I said, maximize on his impact.
Yeah. I mean, Jake's, I guess, how does it benefit me moment just seems to be, I get to go on a fun adventure in a place in a fantasy game world, I guess.
Yeah.
Which we'll get into that a little bit later, but no, like I think you're right that Al has had this portal for years and years and years, and what has he done with it? Well, he's allowed himself to get cheap meat, so he can keep his tiny little diner afloat, and that's it.
Yeah, cheap meat, and then done a lot of research on Oswald, which is fundamentally for at least what he sees as being a selfish ends, where it's like he's trying to save JFK.
Yeah,
would have done it himself, but he got cancer.
He takes some vacations, right? He takes a little midweek vacations. So it's not that he's not taking advantage of it. Yeah, but he's not doing, like, you're right. The time travel stories are the Biff Tannen who gets the almanac and makes himself the richest person in the world. Yeah.
Right. I mean,
none of that here.
It's, I mean, it's easy to think of how you could become enormously wealthy, like very quickly. Like you would just like figure out like what's the best stock trade in the next 6 months or whatever, and then make that trade, and then in the past change it for gold, bring the gold back to the present, leave the gold there, do exactly the same thing again 50 times. and like it doesn't matter, because every time you do it, it's a fresh time. Yeah. So it doesn't matter if they, they're not going to get wise to you, right? So I'm just saying, like, my brain conditioned on sci-fi is like thinking about this in a very different way than what the characters are. Yeah. To the point where it's almost frustrating, but because like not like it is almost frustrating, but I'm like, okay, but that's not what this book is doing. Like, this book is just doing a different thing. And I have to, and I mean, by the end of this week's reading, I was like on the wavelength of the book. I'm just like reporting kind of the thought process as we're going through it.
Yeah. No, makes sense. Cool. All right. Well, we've got a lot to talk about as we get there, but let's try to get to this prologue first.
All right.
So we meet Jake as he's grading papers from his adult English class. The subject is the day that changed my life, and Jake reads a theme from The Janitor. And it's a tough one.
Yeah, and it's going to keep coming back to remind us.
So I love this line here. There were no violins or warning bells when I pulled the janitor's theme off the top of the stack and set it before me. No sense that my little life was about to change. But we never know, do we? Life turns on a dime. I really just like the reason I pulled this out was that we never know, do we? Which is almost a carbon copy of what Edgar says after Wireman's death at the end of Do and Key. We never know. We always think we have time, but we never know. So it's just a common refrain we're seeing here with King.
I like that. Yeah, I like that.
So we learned that the day that changed the janitor's life was the day his father murdered his entire family and hurt him real bad. This is a horribly depressing story that makes the incapable of crying Jake cry really, really bad. Enough for him to give this paper an A+. I love this line, Matt. I stroked a big red A on the top of his paper, looked at it for a moment or two, then added a big red plus. Because it was good, and because his pain had evoked an emotional reaction in me, his reader. And isn't that what A+ writing is supposed to do? Evoke a response? Yeah, it is. Yeah, I agree.
That is the definition of good writing, Mr. King. You're right.
So, Matt, this is, as we approach the end of the prologue, this is what I want to talk to you about. Like, Jake basically says, without saying it, that this is his watershed moment. This is the moment that changes everything for him and leads him down the entire story, for instance. And it doesn't have anything to do with John F. Kennedy. Like, in fact, we learn here that Jake doesn't particularly care about JFK. He's in his young 30s. I think he's like 33, 34. Kennedy was dead well prior to his birth. He's not a history teacher or anything, not someone with knowledge of the importance of JFK outside of, cultural osmosis. And like the overarching story of the plot, actually, we'll see in a couple chapters, isn't even Jake's idea. It's just one that someone else gives to him. And this is important, right? Like, this is telling you what the story is. Like, you thought you were about to read a book about the assassination of JFK. And that's not really what it is. It's not really a book about John F. Kennedy. It's only barely about his death. This is about Jake Epping. This is about his tears. And this is about those events and what they lead to.
Yeah. I mean, yes, we're rooting it in this moment where he becomes aware of this terrible thing that happened, that he then gains the ability to change. And I don't know, like, plot wise, how much of the book is going to be centered on stopping this specific event from happening. But I think regardless of whether half the book is about this event or not, thematically, this is what the book is about. It's the idea of something that's just so horrible that it can make this man who reports that he is not a crying man, weep. And then what do you do about that? Do you, is that, does the fact that it made you weep mean that it needs to be changed, or are there tragedies that still needed to happen in some sense?
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like it's premature to maybe get too specific about what questions we're asking, but those are the kinds of things that are going through my mind anyway.
Yeah. And they're definitely there in the periphery, I think, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. At last, we're on chapter 1. We're going to have to speed this up a little bit. The chapter picks up not long after our prologue. We see that Harry Dunning, school janitor, passes adult English, gets his GED. And can we just, like, I find Harry just so delightful. Like, his insistence on calling Jake Mr. Epping. I love this when he says, and that A+, sheesh. I never got an A+ in my whole life. Never expected one either. Just like, he gets taken to the diner by Jake, the local diner that surely will not become plot relevant here, to celebrate this moment. He gets a picture on the wall, and it's this really heartwarming moment for this guy who went through hell and made his way through it and is now a high school graduate.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we spend a bunch of time up front in this story making us really care about Harry. It's quite sweet, actually.
I actually really like the detail that, like, he got his GED essentially for no reason, right? Like, it's not like he, finally my high school diploma, now I can apply for this job that I've always wanted. It's like, no, actually 2 years later, he's just retiring now. Really, he essentially just got his GED because he never got it and he wanted to. And again, this makes you like him, makes you care about him. Yeah.
It's not like he even had something to prove to anybody except maybe to himself that he could do it. And yeah, just a likable guy.
Yep. And as Henry is thanking Jake on his last day in work, we get this moment right here that I think is worth talking about. I grabbed for him. My intention was to make him apologize, but Harry stopped me. His smile was easy and unoffended. Nah, don't bother. I'm used to it. They're just kids. That's right, I said, and it's our job to teach them. I know, and you're good at it, but it's not my job to be anybody's, teachable moment, especially not today. There's a lot there, Matt.
Yeah, there's a lot there. There's a lot everywhere. There's a lot everywhere in this book, as I found as we kind of started to dig in here. Like, it definitely seems thematic what he just said. Yeah. This idea that Harry has accepted what happened to him and moved on, and even when these stupid teenagers are poking at it, it doesn't upset him. He has truly accepted what happened to him, as horrible as it is, as unacceptable as it is. He has accepted it. It's his story, and he has accepted it. And now Jake is gonna change it. He's gonna take that away, take away that acceptance. Right? Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. And the idea of, like, forgetting the person in it, right? Like, like I it is not my job to be anybody's teachable moment. Yeah. The same, like, but that's literally what he's going to become, because they're using him as a test case for this whole concept. Like,
right.
Like, this is the let's teach ourselves if this thing works. Yeah. Yeah. Right. I think that, like, again, this is subtle, right? It's not at the forefront of what the book is doing, but I do think it's there. Like, these things really jumped out to me.
Yeah. Well, I think it only jumped out to me because you pulled out the paragraph, and then I was like, I see exactly what we're doing with this paragraph, although I didn't necessarily see that deeply into it the first way through. I mean, the more you look at it, the more clear it is, right?
Yeah.
Because he's going to chastise the kid. He's going to get justice, and then Harry stops him. He's like, "Nah, it's fine. Don't worry about it." And then he argues. He's like, "No, it's our job to teach them." He's like, it is, but I don't want to, like, I don't need this. I don't need justice for this thing. This is not, this is about you, Jake. This is about you wanting to feel better about this. This is not about me, the victim, right? Like, it's a very interesting dynamic, and it's totally like you can actually relate to both sides of this, right? You can relate to being offended on Harry's behalf.
Yeah.
But also you can see how that kind of doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like this guy went through this horrible tragedy, and he's had to live his life being made fun of by people for his limp, for just being kind of slow in the head, and it is very human to want to like come to the defense of those people and be like, no, you can't do this. You can't treat people like this. This is wrong. It's noble, but if someone's not asking for it, if someone's not asking you to go back in time and fix their life for them, you shouldn't do that. And maybe that the book is saying you shouldn't do that, right? That was me talking there. But is the book definitively saying that or not? I don't know.
It definitely is engendering more humility about time travel than I'm used to having, because like I said a minute ago, like my instinct when it comes to time travel stories is to just immediately go hog wild, right?
Yeah.
And I think this book is nudging us to reconsider that approach.
Yeah. So in this moment, Jake gets a call from Al, the owner of the not relevant Al's Diner, who sounds sick and wants to see him immediately. An odd request, we're told, because basically their relationship up until this point is patron and chef. They're not really friends. I did like this part, though, in future context, though. He's talking about how Al sounds really sick, and he says, "It must have hit you fast. I had just been in yesterday to grab an early supper, a fat burger, fries, and a strawberry milkshake. I believe it's important for a guy living on his own to hit all the major food groups." You could say that, or you could say it took a while. Either one would be right. I didn't know how to respond to that. That's just an asshole thing to do, Al. To just like... You don't need to do that.
Yeah, you can just imagine him going around the 1950s and 60s making these cryptic remarks in every possible context. Just people like, what is he talking about?
Yeah. Also, can we comment on Jake Epping's diet?
Yeah, it sounds like a normal diet. I don't know what you're...
Really?
Yeah, it's a normal lunch for me.
Like we learned he goes into this place a lot to eat a hamburger, fries, and a strawberry milkshake, which
burger, fries, and a shake.
Not good for you.
5,000 calories per sitting. Yeah.
At least the meat doesn't have all that genetic engineering in it, right? So
that's true. That is true. It just has the like mercury from the lack of any kind of regulation whatsoever.
So Jake heads over to Al's, which he sees noting as permanently closed. And I really love what the reaction to this is. I had not yet entered the fog of unreality that would soon swallow me, but the first tendrils were seeping around me, and I felt them. Okay, so I've just contradicted us to what we said earlier there, because this is very clearly a have some knowledge of future event kind of narration here.
Damn it.
Just right away, chapter 1.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I did appreciate, like, King writes a lot of stories about normal people encountering the supernatural, right? I really appreciated this one where, like, this is really a very normal guy, and I really thought it was a believable, slow-paced introduction of this character to this supernatural thing, and where he reacted, I think the way I would react, where it's just like, this is freaking me out, and I love this like fog of unreality, but it's like, okay, it's not like it's not scary. It's not like there's vampires or clown monsters. It's just a weird closet you go in, and then you turn, and then you're in the 1950s, and that's weird enough, frankly. But I don't know. I guess I appreciated like the seriousness with which even that sort of, you know, not necessarily terrifying premise was taken by the story.
Yeah, and kind of the slow, like the weird things mount up. Seeing this sign that suddenly this diner that I've been going to is closed, and then he sees Al, and Al looks completely different. He looks years older. He looks clearly sick, we know only 24 hours have passed, and it's just like this slow kind of, you know, I guess begrudging, but maybe that's not the right word. Like acceptance of the unreality that's happening here.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think it would have to be right. And it also speaks to the kind of character that he is, the kind of
Yeah.
person that he is, where he's not gonna, um, he doesn't accept it easily, but he does accept it eventually.
Sure. I do love this though, the way, like, I think most people reading this book, whether they know what the details of what it's about or not, like probably know it's a time travel book. And so like as we get into these moments with Al inexplicably suddenly with cancer, he's aged years in the course of a day. Like I just love that King holds the actual, like, it's time travel reveal for as long as he can. Like Al doesn't ever come out and say it, right? He just sends Jake back to 1958. But we're still playing with the ages and the dates and this fun fact that we learned that Al can somehow still sell his grade A meat burgers for a fraction of what it costs other places, and how is that possible? And I think maybe we're kind of ahead of Jake with this stuff here, and so you get that moment of, it's fun to feel ahead of the character. You feel a little bit superior to the character, and that makes you enjoy the moments a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a fun kind of dramatic irony. Yeah.
Yeah. So Al takes him back to the pantry. He takes his wallet and phone away from him. He hands him some old looking money, and he says, "Go walk down those steps. But first, like, there's a yellow card man, and you got to do this whole scripted thing with him and give him 50 cents. And you're not going to know why, but just do it." We'll talk more about the yellow card man in a bit, but I needed to bring it up here, of course.
It's interesting, I think, because it gives you a sense of anxiety and uncertainty.
Yeah.
Whereas I think without the yellow card man, it's like, yeah, whatever. But it's like if you have to, there's like a certain ritual, there's a certain guy you have to interact with in a certain way, and if you don't do it right, then ... Like I think the book intentionally doesn't tell you like, well, wait, like what happens if I don't give him the coin? Like what are the parameters exactly? And we still don't know. By the end of this week's reading, we still don't know, like, how did you figure out that you have to give him the coin, and how did you figure out, and again, what happened when you didn't follow the script the first time?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I imagine there will be more from the yellow card man.
Yeah. I think that's fair. So with that in mind, he tells Jake to walk, and Jake begins walking down the steps until he simultaneously hits a step and goes through the step, and then away we go. We're on to chapter 2 and our first journey back to 1958. So Jake takes a few more steps and feels a popping noise in his head, and then finds himself suddenly in the sunlight. Al's is gone, and he finds himself next to a functioning textile mill that he knows for a fact closed down decades ago. So suddenly in the past.
I feel like something similar happens in the Dark Tower with regard to a popping sensation when there's like teleportation. Am I wrong? I don't know if
no, I think you're right there. I think you're right. Yep.
Speaking of the Dark Tower, I just wanted to parenthetically say, Jake and Jack are names that King has used before, often for characters who are travelers either in space or time.
Yeah, that's true.
Jake, both a space and time traveler. And
yeah, really the only instance of, like, there actually isn't too much time travel in the Dark Tower. There's a little bit. And it was most prominently Jake doing it.
It's more, it's more like time being, fluid than time travel in the usual sense. But I mean, there's some time travel.
There is some,
but the point is, like, it's interesting that we have the Jake name being used again. And I looked up what epping means, and it actually basically means upping, which is I don't know what that means. If anything, I guess I was thinking about the fact that he goes up and down the stair, and it's like if we want to impose some directionality onto his existence, it's like going up, you know.
Interesting. I like
I,
that. I do wonder how King comes about his character names. That's something I've never seen him talk about in an interview or anything. Is like, because there are some authors that attach specific meaning to character names, right? They search for names and they assign names with meaning behind them. And I think there are some authors that just like, I don't know, I needed a name and it was the first one that came to me. Um,
yeah.
and I don't really know. I feel like King is probably a little of both.
Yeah, I mean, he reuses names. Like I feel
Mm-hmm.
like Dufresne has been in several things, and Jake and Jack and Eddie and we've talked about this before, right? But
Yeah, yeah.
it's I don't know. That's why I brought it up here. Is I was like really felt significant that the name was Jake, and then I was like Epping, like that's an unusual name. That's gotta it's got to be some choicefulness behind that.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not sure.
Who knows? Yeah. It's the type of thing where you're looking it up, convinced that you're about to see like, this all makes sense. And then it's just
Yeah.
oh, okay. Well, that doesn't
That's
really shine any light on anything, but
that's exactly what happened. Yes.
So Jake's first experience here is this. I didn't go anywhere at first, just stood still, wiping my mouth with the palm of my hand. My eyes felt like they were bugging out of their sockets. My scalp and a narrow strip of skin all the way down the middle of my back was crawling. I was scared, almost terrified, but balancing that off and keeping panic at bay for the moment was a powerful curiosity. And I think this is important, right? That the curiosity and the sense of adventure that Jake gets upon returning to the past, I think is really important and key to his character here. And defining this early makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I agree. I think he's not the most adventurous guy in the world, but he does have this streak of curiosity in him, and that gives us something.
Yeah, yeah. So, letting that curiosity take hold, Jake tears a strip of paper and puts it down where he knows the step home is so he can go back if he needs to. And then he goes walking into 1958. And I loved this line as well. As he's putting that paper down, a snatch of some old pop song drifted through my head. First there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. This, Matt, is by a singer named Donovan. It was released in 1967. So before Jake's birth, but also the future from the current time he's in. The line itself comes from a Buddhist saying, and I thought it'd be fun to kind of talk about perhaps what that could mean.
Yeah, so the far less pithy version of the saying would be something like, I mean, there's different versions of it, but one of the versions that I found was, before one studies Zen, mountains are mountains and waters are waters. After a first glimpse into the truth of Zen, mountains are no longer mountains and waters are no longer waters. After enlightenment, mountains are once again mountains and waters once again waters. And
Yeah.
I think the breakdown is, first you see everything as being literal, as being the surface without depth. And then you get a glimpse of the depth and you feel like you've comprehended the deep truth that underlies everything, and you see everything as an illusion. And then you like keep living your life and you're like, oh yeah, the deep truth is there. But the deep truth gives rise to the surface, and the surface is still there, and the surface is not replaced by the deep truth. It just is also there, and you just go on with your life. And I've also heard before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water, which is I think a similar vibe.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that I just to round out the thought, like I feel like this is a bit connected to this notion of like realizing that you have this power to change the world, and then maybe eventually realizing that it's kind of still the world either way. Like like before time travel, there's a mountain, and after time travel, there's maybe a different mountain, but still a mountain. I don't know. Just a thought.
Yeah. No, I like that. I think that fits very well.
Cool.
So on his way out, Jake bumps into our yellow card man, Matt, and we get our first description of him. He was wearing an old black overcoat that puddled around him like an amorphous shadow. There were dried crackles of snot on both sleeves. The body inside the coat was scrawny to the point of emaciation. His iron gray hair hung in snaggles around his beard-scruffy cheeks. He He was a wino if ever a wino there was. Cocked back on his head was a filthy fedora that looked straight out of a 1950s film noir, the kind where all the women have big bazonkas and the men talk fast around the cheek, the cigarettes stuck in the corners of their mouths. And yep, poking up from the fedora's hatband, like an old-fashioned reporter's press pass, was a yellow card. Once it had probably been bright yellow, but much handling by grimy fingers had turned it bleary. So here's our man, and Al kind of describes the yellow card man as being the only one who seems to know that something's up with their presence here, right? And indeed, we see the question he asks to Jake is, who are you? What are you doing here? So any idea what's going on with this guy at all, Matt? Is he important at all, or is this just all just flavor?
I mean, no, I don't really know where we're going. It does suggest that he has some level of awareness that something is up, something is off. Why? Does he have the shine? Is he a time traveler? Is he Jake from a later time loop? You know, who knows, man. I think at this point it is effectively just flavor for now, but we may need to, you know, have a conversation with this guy at some later point in time, figure out what he knows. Why is he here? Because you know, I mean, anytime you get a time travel situation and there's an element that sticks out, you got to follow up on that, man. It's super important, or you'll end up in the Eternal City situation with that one guy.
Okay. So Jake walks through the parking lot of the factory, noting that the newest car is one coming from the mid-50s, and seems to have basically at this point kind of just caught up with the idea that he's traveling through time. He walks up to the Kennebec Fruit Company, a store that still exists in the present, albeit a rundown, barely hanging on version of it. Jake goes in, sees a paper that confirms is indeed September 9th, 1958. And Matt, here at the Kennebec Fruit Company is where we learn about Moxie. Have you ever heard about Moxie, Matt? The soda Moxie? It's real.
I've never heard of it at all. Apparently it tastes like bitter root beer. FYI, I guess.
Yeah. So not only is it real, Matt, it is the official soft drink of Maine as of 2005. And the Maine Moxie Festival is indeed a real thing that happens every July in Lisbon Falls, Maine. Unfortunately, we didn't time this very well with our trip to Maine this summer. We should have made it line up better that we could hop over to Lisbon Falls and go on the Moxie parade.
Oh, this is a huge oversight.
So I have never had Moxie. I don't think you ever have either.
Nope.
It is a very specifically New England soda. But don't worry, Matt. I have ordered us both a case. It is on the way to you right now. So we will update the listeners next week about how good Moxie is.
A case, you say?
I mean, it's 12 cans, man. There's nothing else I can do.
Yeah. No. I'll find a use for it.
You have to. I paid for this with our hard-earned money.
What's fun about having really unusual sodas is that you can always pretend that they're like from another dimension where you bought them, or from another timeline, you know?
Yeah. I do think it's like the description on Wikipedia of how this thing tastes is, as you said, it tastes kind of like root beer, but with a bitter aftertaste. Mm-hmm. And I got to tell you, that sounds gross.
Yeah. I'm sure it's gross, but as a person who used to have a roaring Diet Coke addiction, I can tell you that like the way a soda tastes is pretty much uncorrelated to how much of it you'll end up drinking.
That's fair. The people of New England are very passionate about their Moxie, though. There's a Moxie Congress that is a group of people pledged to continue the hard work of making Moxie a respected brand.
Wow.
I'm not making this up. Moxie was bought by Coca-Cola in 2018, by the way. So it is now a Coca-Cola product.
Well, good for them.
Also, like we joked about it in the intro, the word Moxie, as in you got Moxie Kid, is reportedly said to come from this drink. Although, when you look into it more, you kind of realize that's just a company line, and it's probably not true, that both of those things probably came from the exact same origin point.
Yeah. But who knows? Who knows anymore?
Nobody knows. Nobody knows.
Let's just go with it. Let's just say that when somebody says you got Moxie Kid, they're talking about this soft drink.
Yeah, you are holding a delicious bitter root soft beverage.
Yeah, that's what I always thought when somebody said you got Moxie Kid. I thought that specific thing.
Yeah. Of course, the Kennebec Fruit Company store of 1958 has yet to be moxified. It actually sells fruit.
Uh-huh.
And as it turns out, absolutely delicious root beer. Jake describes the taste as full. And I think this is one of the things we're going to need to talk about a lot throughout the course of this book, Matt. This book, I guess, is the question, and by extension, Stephen King, nostalgic for times gone by. You know, like the 1950s and early 60s, for that matter, are like a very popular nostalgic time for people to look back at. And I think we have to say, in some ways, yes, in this moment, there is some 50s nostalgia here, right? The fruit company comparison between its drab, collapsing future counterpart that basically exists off the back of this not good tasting soda, as compared to this lively, young and fruit selling one of yesteryear, invites the comparison of like, oh, things were so much better in the olden days. We also see Jake comment on how nice and friendly everyone is being. And Al even mentions later, you know, people talk to you back in this time. Like you walk up and ask a person a question and they'll be nice and talk to you. And that's not the way things are anymore. So there's definitely some of this going on, right?
Right. I mean, I think the rejoinder here is so we can assume Jake is white, I guess. Which
Yes,
I think kind of says it all, where it's like there's some great stuff about the past, people are more friendly, etc. Like that's why we're fixated on the past. Of course, there is actually some great stuff about the past, but let's not forget that a lot of stuff was actually way worse. And I think we'll probably get into that dynamic, right? I mean, Jake is just sort of reintroducing himself to this, or introducing himself. He never experienced this time. You know, he was not alive, right? I think we talked about this, or maybe whatever. This is the first time he's been in the 50s, so it's not even like real nostalgia. It's nostalgia for a time that he never actually experienced, and so he'll have to come to grips with the bad parts eventually.
Yeah, no, I agree. And to King's credit, I do think the bad parts are like here on the periphery as well. I think we're getting hints here that like the rose-tinted sunglasses view of the past ain't exactly the whole story. Like we do get these bits about the chemical smell in the air around this place, and the lack of an EPA is probably damning the people that work there to lifelong lung issues that could develop into cancer and worse into their elder years. Like, so there is some of that here, right? It's not entirely just, oh, isn't this place great?
It's you're right, and I think it's kind of funny and interesting because I'm gonna try to keep the math straight here, but like this book is written as if you and I wrote a book about a time traveler going back to like 1995 and walking around and like making fun of how shitty everything is and just like unbelievably bad and like, oh my god. And it's like, well, that's like we did experience that, like just the way King did experience this, and at the time he wasn't thinking about the EPA. It was just normal. It was just, that's the way things are. But he's recontextualizing it through the eyes of a younger of a man who was born later, I should say, who didn't experience it, and thus is seeing it with these fresh eyes and capable of being like properly shocked by it, you could say.
Yeah, no, I like that. I also really like this part, Matt. I decided I liked these two as much as I liked the root beer. I even liked the aspiring teenage hood outside, if only because he didn't know he was already a cliche. There was a sense of safety here, a sense of, I don't know, preordination. It was surely false. This world was as dangerous as any other, but I possessed one piece of knowledge I would before this afternoon have believed was only reserved for God. I knew that the smiling boy who had enjoyed the Shirley Jackson story, even though he didn't get it, was going to live through that day and over 50 years of days to come. He wasn't going to be killed in a car crash, have a heart attack, or contract lung cancer from breathing his father's secondhand smoke. Frank Anicetti was good to go. I love this. I love this as a concept of how, like, evocatively dangerous this idea of traveling to the past, and perhaps by extension this idea of nostalgia about the past is, right? Like, it is safe because you don't have to worry about all the things that everyone living in that time have to worry about, because you possess knowledge of the future events. Like, that is nostalgia. When we nostalgically look back to times, even times that we ourselves have never been a part of, we are just cherry picking the good, nice parts of those times. We are not remembering the hard times. We're not remembering the difficult parts. It's just, things were so much simpler back then, when we didn't have to worry about the specific anxiety I have right now. Right, that was not present back then. So I want to be back there. And this is, I think, a great representation of that concept.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't know if I necessarily got there from this, but I really love this idea.
Mhm.
Like I've sort of, you put yourself in the thought experiment, like what would you do if you could send a message back in time,
Mhm.
or time travel? And like I thought about, like, one of the things I would send back to myself is like, don't, basically some flavor of don't worry about it, everything turns out fine. and it's which, you could also give yourself, like, by NVIDIA, obviously. But I think, like, it's actually, to take it seriously for a moment, like, you don't want to mess things up. You want, like, I'm a happy person. I don't want to change things. I just want to kind of give myself a little bit of a psychic break from
Yeah.
worrying, right? But it's even that is an illusion, right? Because even hearing that everything's going to be fine might cause you to be less careful, and then everything's not fine suddenly, right? So
Yeah.
I think it is an illusion. Like I don't remember exactly how you said it just now, but like I think what you just said is perfect. It's like a mirage that you can live in a way where you're never worried, and it's like, well, that's a fantasy that doesn't exist,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah, and in the specific realm of the story itself, not the metaphor, it's also the ways in which you could see this very real, very dangerous place can be uh underestimated by Jake, right? Like,
Hmm.
you get this sense of power, this feeling of invincibility, because I know what's going to happen. And as we'll learn furthermore, I know that I can run back up some steps and come back down, and everything I've done is erased, and it's a world of no consequences for me. And I think that is also, as I think the book will demonstrate, also an illusion. That's not real either. Just because you can run away doesn't mean that none of this stuff has any consequences.
Yeah, that's true.
I also really liked this quote right here, Matt. Jake is talking to young Frank about the way he does not understand Shirley Jackson's The Summer People, or at least according to his English teacher. And he says, "There's nothing to get." No, that's not what Mr. Marchant says. With all due respect to Mr. Marchant, you tell him Jake Epping says that sometimes a cigar is just a smoke and a story is just a story. He laughed. I will. Period 3 tomorrow morning. So Matt,
Uh-huh.
what do you think about this?
I really love this. And I think this isn't that far off from what King has said in other contexts about, like,
Mhm.
stories where he's, what he's saying through Epping is something like, don't read stories as if they're puzzles and you're supposed to find the secret thing behind the story that the story is hiding or obscuring from you. The thing you're supposed to get from the story is just exactly the experience of the story.
Yeah.
And yeah, you're free to try to understand that experience, and you're free to analyze and ask questions about that experience. But fundamentally, to think that you read the story and you don't get it, I think it's like you're looking behind the thing, and the thing is the thing that you were supposed to see. It's like, first there is the story, first there is the mountain, then there is no story, then there is no mountain, and then there is a story, then there is a mountain. It's a process of enlightenment where you end up right where you started, but you're aware of, like, what the point of all of this is, I think.
I agree. I completely agree. I think the exact wrong thing to take away from this idea is that King is saying through Jake Epping that stories don't mean anything. That's obviously not true, right?
Yeah.
Like for example, the story we're talking about is a story called The Summer People, which is about people coming from a place to a place they don't belong, and how that place, when they try to stay there too long, does not like that and pushes back against them. That's literally what Jake is doing right now.
Yeah.
So like the idea that Summer People doesn't mean anything is absurd, right? Like it means something in this story right now, but that's not what we're saying here. We're saying that the approach to storytelling, as I think you said it perfectly, a puzzle that you're supposed to unlock, that if you reach the end of a story and the teacher says, I don't think you understood it, I don't think you got it, it's like, well, did you like it? Did it entertain you? Did you take something away from it that's maybe not what your teacher took away from it? Well then you got it.
Yeah.
Then you got it. And I think that like I obviously I enjoyed English class a lot. You can see by what we're doing right now, we're talking about stories. Like I enjoyed that a lot, but I did think like the method of let's find what specifically this story means, not what it means to you, but what it means. And if you don't get there, Mr. Marchant will be like, yeah, you didn't understand it.
Yeah. I think my best, right. I think my best English teachers were the ones who were more like, let's ask questions and let's throw out interpretations. And they didn't have in mind like, and here's the correct interpretation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Jake, having enjoyed his time here, heads out. He is clearly enjoying himself, Matt. He sees a couple ladies looking for fruit, and he wishes he could get a fedora, quote, like the ones you see in the old movies, to tip his hat to them. I think this is important because I think this demonstrates Jake's attitude towards this whole place, which is, this is fun. This is a game. This is, I'm an actor playing a part, and I've been granted access to the holodeck. And there's nothing here that matters ultimately, and I'm gonna have fun with it because I got to get my costume next time and have fun. Now I do think we're doing this on purpose here.
Yeah, right. I mean, if you didn't have like the whole Dark Tower and the concept of multiverses in the back of your head, then it would be very tempting to think like, I can do whatever I want. I can do absolutely whatever I want. I think, unfortunately, it would immediately occur to me that like, even if this resets, I probably just created a new universe actually, and so this is not consequence free. But and I don't know if this book will directly address that or not, but that was definitely something I was thinking about because this seems like a perfect candidate situation for creating a bunch of screwed up multiverses.
Yeah, but even if that's not the case, just the general idea that we can be blasé about our time here and think of it as a game that's fun with no with I think it's dangerous. It's certainly dangerous.
Yeah, it's a dangerous way to live your life. Yeah.
So Jake heads back, slightly panicking that his door to the future might be closed. It's not, of course, and he finds himself back in 2011. We learn a few rules from Al as Jake gets back. No matter how long you're there, you always come back exactly 2 minutes later, and every trip to the past is the first time. You return to the exact same time in 1958, so everything you had done last time is essentially erased. I think these are cool and interesting, and I don't know, maybe slightly different rules from other time travel stories we've seen. I don't think I've seen it presented quite like this before.
Yeah. I don't think so either. I think that these are fairly restrictive rules, right? Like we do read a lot of stories about time travel. Some of these stories do have restrictive rules, but even the most restrictive of the ones I can think of don't have this like hard reset idea built into them where it's like you can do it as many times as you want, but it's going to be basically the same trial every time. And it also, I think it lends toward a much more conservative approach, just like strategically, like what are we going to do? It's funny. I guess I'll save some of this for later, but I kind of went off on a tangent in my head about like, well, if I was in this situation, I would just do this. And then I like absolutely talked myself in a huge circle and ended up pretty much back where the characters are. We'll talk about it in a second, but I was, okay. I was like downright annoyed because I was like, shit, King actually thought this through really well.
That's great. So Jake also finally realizes why Al could sell the meat so cheap. He was going back to 1958, buying it cheap and bringing it back. And since every time is the first time, technically Al was just buying the same beef over and over and over again. Does this hurt your brain, Matt, or you just accept this quote unquote paradox?
I mean, time travel itself is a paradox, so sure, well, whatever. Yeah, it's fine.
I just love the idea that every single person that has ever eaten a burger at Al's has essentially eaten the same burger from the same cow. I love that concept. That's great.
Yeah, me too.
So Al wants to tell Jake the full story of kind of why he's sharing this with him, what's going on. But he's feeling a bit too sick, so he asks he invites him back to his house later that night. And so we prepare to end our chapter. And I loved this line here. Jake is kind of like beside himself, and he's wandering around and he's thinking to himself. And we end the chapter on this. It sounded new. Did I want to spend years in the past? No, but I did want to go back, if only to hear how little Richard sounded when he was still top of the pops, or to get on a Trans-World Airlines plane without having to take off my shoes, submit to a full body scan, and go through a metal detector. And I wanted another root beer. So again, I think this echoes kind of something we've been talking about before, this idea of this illusionary allure of the past, like this idea of like, man, things were better back in the old days when I didn't have to take my shoes off to get on an airplane. Yeah. Except we forget that like people didn't wake up one day and just decide we're going to do this now. There was a reason for that. Even if it's not an effective deterrent, there was a reason we started doing it.
And also, I mean, nobody likes having to do that. It's obviously on some level stupid that we still do it, but like, it's a pretty minor inconvenience. And I think it's actually kind of, relevant here that he's like, the things he's complaining about. It's like, oh God, the luxury of being able to go on a plane without having to briefly inconvenience myself for like 30 seconds. Like, that's not really like, is that really the motivation for time travel?
No,
to get on a plane.
I think it's just like this is the thing. Honestly, I think these are the things people think about when they think about like nostalgia and going back to the past. Is like just like not even the big things sometimes, but just like, here's the things in my life that annoy me, the things that I wish I didn't have to put up with. Like, and these are the things we glowingly look back to the past for. It's like, oh yeah, we didn't have to do these things. Like, it's like sometimes you'll like in the middle of a hard day at work on your computer and just be like, I think I'd be happier at work before everyone had a computer and we were all doing email. And it's like, that's not true. That's not accurate. That's like, you'd still have a stressful day, and it's just the annoyances will be different annoyances. But like, this is how the human mind works sometimes. The central, the grass is always greener concept, right?
Right. Yes, you're just tired of this and you want a change of pace.
And the past it invites this very alluring and false mirror of a time before that thing existed, because you can look back on it with the power of future knowledge and know this is a thing that exists now but did not exist then. Isn't that great? Isn't it great to go back to a time when that thing that is annoying me right this particular minute isn't around yet?
Exactly. Yep.
It's great. I love it.
Yep.
Chapter 3 begins with Jake arriving at Al's house, noting the Texas flag on the gnome outside. I like this choice, Matt. This is interesting. Like, it's a hint for Jake of where things are going. Like, he uses the presence of the Texas flag to kind of make the JFK connection before Al even says it. But I also like it as a little bit of Al characterization. He spent a long time in Texas. Essentially, he was there. At least on this attempt, he was there for 4 years and only came back because he was getting too sick to carry out his plans. And so he's got a little Texas pride he took home with him, right?
Understandable.
Texas gets a bad rap sometimes because of the leaders of the state and their absurdity, but I like Texas.
No, I love Texas. I'm from Texas. Yes.
So we learn here, Matt, that Al is basically done for due to the cancer. But we also learn so is the diner. Even if Al wasn't about to die, the lease is up, and the owners want to put an LL Bean in the spot. The assumption that our characters are operating from is that with the diner gone, the time portal would also vanish. And so if they're going to do this plan, they basically have to act now. And because of the cancer, Al can't do it. And that's why Jake has been tapped for this. That's why Jake is here. He wants Jake to do it.
Yeah. This is very interesting. This is a very interesting way of setting up a story. I haven't quite boiled my thoughts down all the way yet about this, but like sort of the central mission, like almost like the pitch of the novel is this idea of like, we got to save JFK. And it's not even Jake's idea. It's not, Jake doesn't care. It's this other guy's idea. And this other guy, even his motivation is it feels like it's like strained in a sense. Like it's abstract.
Yeah.
It's almost it's like it's like he kind of worked backwards from like, what's the biggest like abstractly good thing that I can do?
Mm-hmm.
And then he decided on this, but it's impersonal, I think is the word I'm looking for.
I think you're right.
It's already impersonal for Al, and it's even more impersonal for Jake. And maybe it'll become personal somehow, but it's just so interesting that things are set up this way, because like we said a second ago, you could have written this book from the perspective of an older man who experienced JFK assassination, gained access to time travel, and was immediately like, oh, you know what I have to do because this would be incredible, is save JFK. This is definitely, and that's just not what we're doing with this story at all.
Yeah. I mean, it's literally just because it's the thing, the watershed event that lines up closest with the portal, right? They talk about the 2000 election. They talk about 9/11. They talk about the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, and they talk about Adolf Hitler. And it's like, yeah, those are all watershed moments too, but those aren't easy to reach. Here we have just 5 years removed from when we walk through that portal. Here we have one, and so it's going to be this one.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just, it's hilarious because you're right. It's like, this is something that is of such great importance to people, obviously, to King. We talked about this. This is the boomers 9/11. And I guess Al technically lived through this, so like he has that shared trauma on some level. But yeah, I think impersonal is such a great word for it, because there's no direct buy-in, especially like we are basically told in this week's reading that if Jake decides to do this, it is going to be hard. Not only will it be difficult, just the logistics of it, but that there's perhaps a thing that exists in the past that is resisting change. And so it's going to be struggle. It's going to be hard. It's going to be dangerous. And he doesn't have any buy-in outside of a dying man asked him to do this as his final wish, right?
Right. I mean, he has far more buy-in when it comes to saving Harry from his father, which we'll see in a bit. But he doesn't seem motivated at all here. So it's like, I kind of know that eventually he has to become motivated. Otherwise, I'm not sure what the story is actually.
Yeah.
But it's funny. I can't really see how we get there from here.
I do think that this next paragraph is part of, King doing work to establish maybe that the answer to that question you just asked. So it says here, I know the basics of suspense fiction. I ought to. I've read enough thrillers in my lifetime, and the prime rule is to keep the reader guessing. But if you've gotten any feel for my character at all, based on today's extraordinary events, you'll know that I wanted to be convinced. Christy Epping had become Christy Thompson, boy meets girl on the AA campus, remember? And I was a man on his own. We didn't even have any kids to fight over. I had a job I was good at, but if I told you it was challenging, it would be a lie. Hitchhiking around Canada with a buddy after my senior year of college was the closest thing to an adventure I'd ever had. And given the cheerful, helping nature of most Canadians, it wasn't much of an adventure. Now, all of a sudden, I've been offered a chance to become a major player, not just in American history, but in the history of the world. So yes, I wanted to be convinced. So I do think, Matt, that is King putting some work into saying, why is Jake going to become invested in this idea?
But it's interesting because it's not like it's not what I would call good. I mean, it's a sort of ego driven motivation.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
In a way, it's like, how can I make American history be about me? I don't. Like, I'm not saying it's necessarily bad either. Like, it's not like it could be worse. He could just be purely self enriching, which is what I would do with the time
Yeah.
portal. But it's interesting, right? It's layered. It's layered.
Yeah.
I also really enjoy that King tips his hand and tells us the rules of suspense fiction while literally doing the thing that he's describing in the book.
No, you're right. You're right. So we do see here, Matt, that Al's kind of tactic for convincing him is outlining what would happen if they saved JFK. He says, no Vietnam, RFK would live, MLK would live, which means no race riots. And this stuff is like convincing, I guess. Like, I agree generally that if JFK isn't assassinated, RFK is not going to be running for president in 68, and so probably would not be assassinated. Like, I agree with that, but man, this is a lot of supposition about how the events of the world would unfold here, right? Like I've been thinking about this a lot with Lincoln, actually, because there's a show on Apple TV called Manhunt happening right now, which is a show about the hunt for John Wilkes Booth after the Lincoln assassination. And not only is it doing that, but it's really going into the details of the failure of Reconstruction and how Reconstruction just completely collapsed post Lincoln. And I think that through line is a little bit more clear than the JFK stuff being presented here. But even with that, it's like, okay, so is it definitely true that Reconstruction would have been more successful had Lincoln not been assassinated? Certainly. But like, Lincoln wasn't going to be president forever. He was already on his second term. And who's to say after he leaves office, someone else isn't elected that is just as regressive on those policies as his predecessor, and just does all the shit that happened in the failure of Reconstruction anyway, right? Like, this is a lot of supposition and assumed understanding of how the cause and effect chains of the history work. And it's just, it's risky.
Yeah. I mean, Reconstruction sounds like uniquely the kind of thing where it's just really, really hard to do. And so there's no guarantee that anybody could have actually done it,
Yeah.
great.
I mean, yeah, there's no, yeah, like even during his term, would Lincoln have been successful? Like, it's so complicated and so messy. And there was such strong resistance to a lot of the ideas being posed that this is the whole one man of history theory, right? That like, that some people are powerful enough to turn the whole arc of history around them. And that is certainly true to one extent, but how true is it that you can guarantee that the thing wouldn't happen if you remove them from the equation?
Yeah. Right. So I think one thing I was thinking about is like, there's two ways of thinking about the world and history and so forth. So one of them, which has been posed to us by the story, is the butterfly effect, where fundamentally the world is chaotic in this view. Minor changes amplify over time. So if you did some minor thing in 1900, maybe the Nazi Party doesn't come to power, and maybe in the year 2000 things are wildly different. But there's an alternative possibility, which is that like maybe minor changes are sort of averaged out or sort of squelched. Maybe things generally run on rails, and we would have gotten the same outcome whether this guy was in charge or that guy was in charge, because the actual forces at play are massive and have enormous momentum behind them. And so kind of didn't matter that much whether we went left or right on this one issue, because it was just superseded by some other choice somewhere else. And also, I mean, I think there's some truth to both. Is the truth of it, is the truth of the matter. Like the world is not purely mechanical. If the world were purely mechanical, then it would be chaotic, and changes would sort of straightforwardly amplify, I think. I'm being a little broad there, but I think that's kind of the idea. But like, we know that there are people, and people can change their plans in response to changing circumstances such that they get the same outcome regardless of what the situation looked like. And so the fact that people have agency means that the course of history might stay on track despite you attempting to change it, because there are people who are dynamically reacting to your attempts to
Sure.
change it.
Yeah.
And I don't know, the book has not really told us, like, is there literally a explicitly supernatural force like intelligently working to stop changes to the timeline, or maybe is it more like this sort of cosmic tendency that we're talking about here, where it's just more like a impersonal force of just how the world works. We'll see. Obviously,
Yeah.
I don't know yet.
Yeah, I love all that. I mean, I think that's absolutely true. And I think the other kind of half of this is I think when we start talking about, the characters like Harry and the characters like I'm blanking on her name, but the wheelchair bound woman that we'll get to in a little bit. Like, what are the good things that happened after the bad thing happened, right? And you could be racing those. I think a great example with JFK is the Civil Rights Act, right? Like the Civil Rights Act that came out in '64 was part of a proposal that Kennedy ran on, and something he was actively working towards. And a lot of people put in work to make that thing happen. But you might be able to argue that the political capital gained by the people in power after the horrible and shocking murder of JFK that kind of galvanized the country was used to get that act passed, right?
Yeah.
And so then you start talking about, okay, well, like if JFK isn't assassinated, does the Civil Rights Act of '64 happen? That's interesting, right? Who
Right.
knows ultimately? But when you're playing with stuff like this, it's just who knows any of it?
Exactly.
Yeah. The one thing this story has, though, Matt, the ace up Al's sleeve, is that you can just test it. If things turn out badly, you just walk up the stairs and you walk down them again. It's all reset. It's done. So that's pretty convincing, right? Like, even if I wasn't entirely convinced that saving JFK would result in a definite better world than otherwise, like, I would be curious enough to test it.
Yeah, it's very tempting, especially with a head full of books about time travel where it's sort of treated as a game.
Mm-hmm.
I think that one thing the book is urging us to consider is, like, things can go wrong in ways that you can't anticipate.
Yeah.
One thing that just crossed my mind while we were having this conversation, I didn't even think about this beforehand, was like somebody sees him go up the stairs and follows him, or precedes him, maybe somehow becomes aware of the stairs. What happens then? Like we have no idea, right? So there's all kinds of ways that things can go wrong. He can be injured or killed in the past. What happens then? So anyway, it's not quite so clean and science, sort of clinical as maybe Al wants it to sound. And I think he knows that too, actually.
Yeah. So we do here talk about the conspiracy theories a bit, Matt. The questions. Was it really Oswald who shot Kennedy? What about the grassy knoll? I'm curious about your opinion on how much the book will invite these theories. Al seems pretty convinced that it was just Oswald working alone, though, as we'll see, not quite enough to take him out himself immediately. But like, this is another unique thing about the Kennedy assassination is these conspiracy theories we talked about. And there is a place in this book to kind of really dive into that and make the story a little bit about that as well. It doesn't seem like we're doing it at this point, but what is your kind of take on how much you think the book will play in that space?
I mean, my guess would be not much, because I think the book seems to want us to embrace this idea that the part of the horror of the Kennedy assassination was the senselessness, the meaninglessness. And if it turns into this almost like, path of the beam type thing, where like this is this confluence of historical events, and like if Oswald hadn't done it, then the FBI would have, or whatever, then it's like, okay, well, that's kind of a different thematic point, which I don't feel like that's what the story is doing here. It may, sure. I could just be off base. But I mean, because that would be that's I'm getting a little bit ahead, but that was one thing I was thinking about as I was like, well, how would I solve this problem? Is it's like, well, it's very, very difficult to conduct a clean experiment here, because just because you change something and you get such and such result, like, it doesn't mean that the reason why you got that result was necessarily because of the reason you thought. I'm not being very clear. Let's just table that, and we'll hit upon it again in a minute when there's a more obvious example.
No, so yeah, I think what you're talking about here is kind of what the general plan is here, which is, Al has created this book of Lee Harvey Oswald history that basically tracks his entire movements and where he's going to be and everything he knows about him, and he's going to hand this over to Jake, and that the plan is that he needs to wait for Oswald to attempt to assassinate General Edwin Walker, something that Oswald actually tried to do. He missed his shot, but we know that the gun used to kill JFK was the same gun fired at Walker. So the plan is, wait till that happens in 1961, I think, confirm that it was Oswald that did that, and that would give you sufficient evidence to confirm that Oswald was the Kennedy assassin, and then at that moment you can take him out. So not in 63, definitely not like the day of the Kennedy assassination. That would be bad. Don't do it then. But get confirmation first, and this is the way to get confirmation. So go Matt, rip this apart. I know you're going to do it.
Well, so this was the thing that was bugging me, and I think by the end of literally writing out this part of the script, I talked myself into a circle, but I'm still not sure. So if it were me and I had a head full of science fiction novels, I would just go to wherever Oswald is in 1958, murder him immediately, and then immediately go back to the future. And if Kennedy is still shot, then it wasn't Oswald. And if Kennedy is not shot, that doesn't actually prove that it wasn't Oswald, but it is highly suggestive that it wasn't Oswald. Now, the reason I got myself confused is I realized if Kennedy is not shot, then it could have been for some other reason. So it only really works as a way of indemnifying. Is that the right word? As a way of letting Oswald off the hook. It doesn't work to prove that Oswald did it.
Sure. It just proves that if he didn't do it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Which has some utility, but I don't. Yeah. But then we realize that, well, there's a lot of risk to trying to murder a guy and then run back to this particular magical staircase, which is maybe not risk that our characters want to take on. So
yeah, especially since I'm pretty sure they said in 58 Oswald was still in Russia. Yeah. So it's not like he can just easily hop a plane to Russia, find him, kill him, and then get back without anybody noticing.
Yeah, that's the thing where I couldn't quite remember the exact detail there, but it's like, yeah, in any case, you're going to have to be doing some waiting. So you can't just immediately do that. I do agree with you there. Yes.
So we're reaching kind of near the end of Al's story here. He's starting to get pretty weak. He's not going to be able to continue very much longer, but he does have one more story for Jake. Before he wanted to put his JFK plan in motion, he did need to do a test himself. He couldn't just kill Oswald and do your test, but he just wanted to see if the past could actually be changed. So he went through history. He found his target, a little girl involved in a freak hunting accident in November of 1958 that left her in a wheelchair for life. And so this is what we're presented with here. It is absolutely true that this is the watershed moment that changed little Carolyn Poulin's life. But the story does a really interesting thing here, Matt, where we get to see what her life looks like in the present day. Is she in a wheelchair? Yes, absolutely. But she's described as strong. She's described as beautiful. She's described as self-sufficient. She's described as happy. She is happy in her life. And the thing about this that I find so interesting is going back to Duma Key, Wireman in that book asked Edgar if he would undo his accident if he was able to. And in that moment in the book, Edgar said, yes, absolutely. And I wonder if Carolyn Poulin would, right? And if we follow the through line that was established in Desperation and Doom McKee, that these acute traumatic events transform you. You stop being the person you were and you become a new version of yourself. Then to do this, to go back in time and to save Carolyn from the accident, aren't they essentially killing Carolyn as she exists? They're killing the person that she became, essentially.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I agree. In fact, I think even a small timeline change could potentially kill many people. Like anytime you change what child was born or not born, you've made an even more irrevocable change. But let's set that aside, because that's sort of tangential to what we're talking about. That this is just the narrow scope of changing someone's life so radically that they're effectively a different person. And yeah, you're denying that other person life. And again, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but we're going to see that Caroline ends up being kind of the same person.
Yeah.
Either way, so it's like, what was really gained here, right?
Yeah, and the thing I love about this in this book is like none of what we just talked about there is explicit in the text, right? It's not like King is pausing the text and saying, you should really be thinking about if this is what Carolyn would want and if this is good. But I do think it's there. I think when we pause and show Carolyn as this strong, beautiful, self-sufficient woman, the way Al argues it is like, isn't it such a fucking tragedy that this beautiful, strong, self-sufficient woman was handicapped in this way? And I think a perfectly valid read is, no, look at her, this beautiful, strong, self-sufficient woman that's happy with her life. Yeah, her legs don't work. Okay, a lot of people's legs don't work.
Yeah, she overcame that. I mean, Susanna Dean, right?
Yeah,
like a character who was in some magical sense, some very explicit sense, made by these horrible attacks on her body that put her in a wheelchair, and it made her into like a hero,
Yeah.
And that's you go back in time and you make it so she doesn't lose her legs. It's like, well, she's not really Susanna Dean. She's not.
Yeah.
There's no yeah, I'm kind of going on a tangent now because I'm thinking about how much of that's how much of that story was like time travel, and
yeah, no, it was. Yeah,
I don't know that I spent a lot of time considering the question of like, well, what would have happened if Jack Mort had been stopped? But it's something to consider maybe for the future.
Yeah. And by the way, one of the reasons why I do think that book is kind of inviting you to be thinking about this in the periphery, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but when Al and Jake are talking about Harry a little bit later, after Al has read his theme paper, Al says, "What a waste! What a waste!" And Jake's response is, "Bullshit. A good life is never wasted." And I'm like, yeah.
Yeah.
Right? That's
right.
That's what we're saying here. Like essentially with Carolyn and also with Harry, that like these are people that have lived their lives and these horrible things have happened in their life. And again, I understand looking at that and being like, it's so sad that this poor girl lost her legs. And if I have the power to fix that, shouldn't I do that? Yeah, but like it's more complicated than just that.
Yeah.
And I love that this is here in the periphery of the book, that all these are all things we're thinking about.
Yeah. Another thing I'm just going to throw in, just almost just to mention it for future reference, is how much this concept touches upon the idea of fate, which King is obviously super concerned with Ka and his own sort of elaborate conception of how fate works. And it's like, well, you have time travel here, you can change fate. It's really quite a headful to consider.
Yeah, and we're making a lot of assumptions and suppositions here. The honest truth is we don't know ultimately what the book is going to say about these things until we get through it. But I
Correct.
do think they're the questions are meaning to be asked, is what I'll say.
Yeah, I agree.
So Matt, here's where another little time travel element is introduced to us. That this concept, we talked about this already, but this concept that the past doesn't want to be changed. That Al, on his way to save this woman, suffers not one but two blowouts on his car. There's a tree that falls in the way. Like, things keep going wrong that seem to be working towards preventing him from succeeding in his mission. And I think that the line is like, something doesn't want it to be changed. I'm pretty sure of that, but it can be if you take the resistance into account. It can be, and I guess that what we're kind of left to ponder here is if it's something as small as, whether or not Carolyn is going to be in a wheelchair or standing. Like, what if you're going to do something that to Al's own admission is as world changing as, I don't know, like saving JFK from being assassinated? How much will the pushback be there?
Yeah. Watershed. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it's interesting because I'm still, right, like agnostic as to what, is this an intelligent force, that the universe is alive and it's intelligently working against you, or is it more like a grandfather paradox type situation where, like, if you change the past radically, then this diner is no longer here, and so the portal is no longer here, and so you never could have even gone back in time in the first place, and so you never could have changed the past, and thus it's impossible, and thus the timeline is sort of working in some more mechanistic sense to keep itself consistent. This is just a fun thing for me to think about. I honestly have no idea what King is going to do with it. I'm just enjoying riffing on it. I wouldn't be surprised if it was more of a, like, the universe is intelligent and fighting against you. But in any case, it's a cool idea.
Yeah, definitely. So our chapter ends, Matt, with Jake realizing an important fact that if things reset every time you go back, that his little trip to get root beer ended up putting Carolyn back into that wheelchair she was in. Oops.
Yeah.
Important lesson for Jake here, though, right? Like, we're trying to instill this idea that, like, the fun game, like going to the holodeck thing that he felt the first time he went. That's not what this is. This is more important than that.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, I keep thinking about one of my favorite book club books we read, The First 15 Lives of Harry August, where the characters in that book really do have a very blasé perspective on changing the timeline because of the specific way that it works in that story. They sort of don't see other people as being real people. And that's, I think that's so the opposite of what this is, where it's like, no, there's really only one timeline. We get basically one shot to make one change, and then have that be permanent. And they're kind of trying to make this one change and make it count. That's the goal here, right?
Yeah. The first 15 Lives of Harry August had like just a fun element where, like, every life he would go back and kill that same person over and over again, right? Yeah. Like, he would do that on every single loop.
The serial killer, yeah.
Yeah, the serial killer. And that, like, is a thing that you have to think about here too, right? Like, if he's going to do this plan, as we'll see in chapter 4 here in a second, that he's going to test if you can really change things by saving Harry Dunning's family from their father. Okay, so he's going to do this, and he's going to climb back up and be back in the future and see if it worked. And okay, it did work. Now I have to go prevent JFK from being assassinated. Oh, but I also have to save Harry Dunning's family from being murdered.
Yeah.
So those are two things I now have to do every time. It's
Bill Murray running around the town catching the kid falling out of the tree and then heading over to save the guy from choking.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of a fun. I really like conceptually. I just really like this King's like slant on time travel here, and the things that this means, and the difficult situations the rules present. Like, is he gonna is is Al gonna make him promise to also save Carolyn? So he's gotta like go save Carolyn and then head to Derry and save Harry's family, and then we're gonna head to Dallas after that and do all this stuff. And if I fuck it up, I got to do all that. Like, yeah, we just don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so we move on to chapter 4, our final chapter of the week. Al gives Jake the night to make his final decision on whether he's going to do this or not. So Jake heads home to his troubled dreams. He wakes up feeling like he was about to cry. And what's the thing that we know he associates with crying? Well, Harry Dunning and his essay. And that brings up kind of where the story goes from here. Jake doesn't really give a shit about JFK, but he does give a shit about poor Harry Dunning. And he decides that he wants to help him out. There's an interesting like stylistic choice that's made here, Matt, where King not only has Jake read the essay that Harry wrote, but he prints a portion of the essay for us in the novel that we get to read as well. So we get to kind of experience exactly what Jake experienced in the gruesome details of what Harry Dunning's father did to his family, in the way that Harry wrote it. Just curious what your thought on that was. Like, why do you think we needed to see it directly rather than just indirectly, of kind of getting the gist of it through the character interactions?
I mean, I think he wants us to emotionally be on Jake's side here. We're with him. We want this to not have happened. It becomes important to us as well as to the character, that we change this. And I really feel like we've been building up to this the whole time, building up empathy for this character who we're going to go try to save. And it seems like just an almost necessary thing to do. Like, once it's posed to us this way, it's like, well, of course we have to stop this. I mean, this is our first priority. And I don't know, it kind of feels like it's going to turn out to backfire horribly, but you can see from the character's point of view that this totally makes sense as a first thing to try to do.
Yeah. I agree with that. It's interesting because we've spent like an hour and a half today talking about how like, oh, I don't know if changing these things is a good idea. But you're right that King is putting in the work to make us be like, oh, I really wish I could see this guy, not having had to witness his entire family die horribly and been brutally hurt and forever changed himself, right? Like, I like the idea that we're personalizing this so much that not only do we understand why Jake wants to do it, but we're kind of like, yeah, hell yeah, man, let's go kill this asshole and fix things.
Yeah. I think we're meant to be in Jake's perspective, and we're meant to feel like this is an obviously good idea, even though maybe it's not an obviously good idea.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see.
So Jake calls up Al and tells him he's coming over and bringing the theme for him to read. He tells him that he decides if he's going to save JFK, he's got to do another test first. He's got to save Harry Dunning's family, who happen to live in a little place known as Derry, Maine.
Oh no.
Yeah, in 1958.
Oh no. Oh dear.
Don't worry, Matt. Nothing bad happens in Derry.
Yeah. Okay.
I do like this thing though. This set here, October of 1958. Al said in a harsh dog bark voice, "Am I supposed to believe that's a coincidence?" I remember what I said to the teenage version of Frank Ansetti about Shirley Jackson's story and smiled. Sometimes a cigar is just smoke, and a coincidence is just a coincidence. All I know is we're talking about another watershed moment. So I think it's really interesting that Al looks at this and says, oh, so this thing that's super important to you just happens to be a few weeks after this time portal exists. Uh-huh. Is it a coincidence, Matt?
I mean, what does coincidence even mean when time travel is in play? Like honestly, like it seems like you've broken the concept of causality. So
okay, sure.
I mean, I'm just sort of like leaning heavily toward no. Although it's not that there can't be coincidences. I'm just I don't know. We're not meant to live in a time travel universe. clearly.
I understand that. I guess the question that's worth asking, and maybe the answer is that we don't get one, is why is there a time portal in his pantry?
Uh-huh.
And why does it go to September 9th, 1958?
Right. Yeah, I guess I felt like we were never going to find the answer to that, and I immediately stopped wondering about it because
Yeah, fair.
it just seemed like one of those things where it's like, this is the conceit, um, which is fine. But it is interesting to consider that, like, well, maybe it does have to do with the fact that there's this one particular event that he in particular would need to change, and the universe wants this to happen, or something. I don't know. It's fun. I hadn't asked myself that question, so it's fun to think
Yeah, I
about.
mean, because we're described as the universe not wanting the past to be changed, then why is there a time portal to
Yeah,
the past? You know,
right.
what? Yeah, I don't know. Maybe we'll get answers. Maybe we won't. But it's interesting stuff. I guess the only reason I'm asking that question is because Al saying, inviting the idea by saying, "Is this supposed to be a coincidence?" And I know essentially Jake bats that away with his callback to his conversation with Frank, but it still puts the idea in your mind, right? Of maybe this portal is here for a reason. Maybe there's
Yeah,
a reason for this.
yeah, true.
Mm-hmm. So Jake's entire argument here, Matt, is that Carolyn was actually a shitty test about whether you could change the past because it wasn't a big enough change. She didn't die. They weren't essentially bringing someone back to life. It's just, just the difference between standing up and sitting down, right? That's all it is.
Yeah, right.
But I think importantly, her life, as you said, essentially stays similar either way, right?
Mhm.
Like she it's not like a dramatic life change. And Harry Dunning, on the other hand, is a much better test because 4 people died. Harry was permanently injured. I mean, he's right, but it also just so happens to get him exactly what he wants, which is he wants to save this guy because he really, really loves this guy.
Yeah, exactly. It's clearly biased. I think that's just a fun element of the story, is we're realizing like how many of these characters that they seem to want to act out of pure good motives, but they end up acting out of like selfish motives. And I don't want to be too hard on them. I sound like I'm condemning these characters when it's like all they're doing is they're trying to be responsible with time travel, which no character in any other book ever does, by the way. But the fact is, it's just almost impossible to be responsible with time travel,
Uh-huh.
which is why it's way more fun to just watch people be crazy with it. Like, I mean, like my thought was like, well, the test that I would run would be I would just go blow up a dam somewhere and then just see what the effect was.
You stop munchkining time travel.
But like that I'm so programmed to try to munchkin to time travel that's immediately what I think about is like, well, let's figure out what the limits are. And that's a absolutely insane and irresponsible way to treat a magic time portal. And also probably not what I would actually do if I
Mm-hmm.
actually had access to a time portal. That's just when you're, munchkinning is the perfect word there, because it's like, yeah, if you're literally in a no stakes pretend environment, you can come up with all kinds of crazy ideas that you would never actually do. And that's the difference between this book and other books, which is why I'm finding it so fascinating.
I think my favorite outlook on this whole thing is from Looper when Bruce Willis just says, "I don't want to talk about time travel shit," and then the movie just kind of puts that aside.
Yeah.
Although it does end up mattering in the end, I guess, technically.
Yeah, but in a way where it's kind of straightforward to understand what's happening.
Sure. Yeah. So Al agrees to the test and then hands Jake over his paperwork and some cash. We learn that Jake's 1958 identity will be one of George T. Amberson, resident of Maine. Once again, we get into paradox territory here, Matt. Any money he takes back with him into the future stays, even when he goes back into the past again. But that money will exist in the past already. He's essentially like doing like a video game dupe trick.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Yeah. See, I'm not the only one munchkinning here. It's just they're being more subtle, I guess.
We haven't talked about this though, but like we learned that the essentially the plan to make money in the past is just an idea that King stole from Back to the Future too. Gambling. Like Al doesn't have a sports almanac, but he does have the internet and a list of all the big sports outcomes from 1958 all the way to 1963. So, Back to the Future doesn't really get into this, Matt, but making money this way is actually like incredibly dangerous, right? Because gambling is not legal.
Yeah.
In 1958. Like I think it would be different these days when like they've made like online betting through all these online sports books. Like it's rampant. You can bet. It's everywhere. It's everywhere right now. But a lot easier to do that. But in 58, you have to find a bookie. It's probably an underground bookie. And you have to win, which bookies don't like.
Right.
It's just really risky.
Yeah. Yeah, that's funny because now you're causing me to reflect on what I said a minute ago, which was like, just pick the winning stock trade and then translate your winnings into gold. And it's like, I have no idea how to make a stock trade in 1958. I bet it's a huge pain in the ass. And furthermore, I have no idea how to convert anything to or from gold.
Yeah.
At any point in history, including now. so the idea that it's just like, oh yes, you just, do that. It's like, oh, okay. Do you know how to do that? I don't know how to do that.
Well, and just anything like that would be noticed. Like if you make a huge successful stock trade, suddenly this person that comes out of nowhere and just says, oh yeah, I'd like to buy 10,000 shares of this just days before it explodes. Like, that's gonna get noticed, just like walking up to a bookie and putting even just a little decent amount of money on a long shot win of something is they're gonna pay attention to you. Whenever a bookie has to pay you out, they're going to pay attention to you.
Right.
And these aren't the most upstanding people in the world. I just like I'm not spoiling anything. I'm just saying, like, if you think about this for more than half a second, you're like, oh, like this thing he's setting himself up to do here is incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, no, it's very funny. I don't remember the context of this, but like, it's very hard to actually think of the foolproof money making scheme, right? Because you can even go like, okay, well, no, I'll be the guy who invented Velcro, and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that sounds easy, right? you have to single-handedly like navigate the world of entrepreneurship and like understanding technology, and there's no it's very hard to find like an actually easy like free lunch way of making money in the past. It's the closest thing I think would be like figuring out where like a massive vein of gold or something is buried, and even that, it's like, does that really even exist? Is that a thing?
Yeah.
It's interesting, very interesting to think about, very fun to think about. That's why it's a fun premise.
The easiest way is you just rob a bank, take the money back to the future, go back, you rob that bank again.
Just don't get shot the first time.
Well, just be good at it,
right?
Obviously.
All
right, so the chapter kind of starts to come to an end here as Al and Jake head back to the diner. There's this really interesting moment, Matt, where Al is like crying as they get there, and he just says he's scared, right? He says he's scared about this whole thing. He's scared about the size of it all. It feels like there's something more there. I don't know. What do you think? What do you think's going on in this moment?
I'm not exactly sure, but I mean, I think Al might have thought a lot more about what they're doing than Jake, and potentially understands the potential ramifications of what's about to happen. Like if Jake is successful, what could happen to Al, right? Yeah. Like it's like one thing we didn't talk about is the fact that Jake comes out of the portal and Al has the newspaper, and it's like, well, how did Al even remember Caroline if it was undone? And it's like, well, it's I don't know, time travel. But like I what's my point? I think it's just like he understands the gravity of what they're doing, and he's been working toward this sort of like half his life or
Yeah.
something.
Mm-hmm.
And Jake is still basically seeing this as an adventure. I
Yeah.
mean, I feel you that maybe there's something deeper, something more specific, but that's what I was thinking during this part. Anyway.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's fair. I don't want to spend too much time on this because it's just like a feeling, right? It's not. There's nothing concrete here.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Okay.
Cool.
All right. So our chapter ends with Jake walking down the stairs and into the past. I love this line here. I tried to smile, but I'm not sure I made it. The briefcase felt very heavy, as if it were filled with rocks instead of money and a bogus ID. I thought I might faint, and yet, God help me, part of me still wanted to go, couldn't wait to go. I wanted to see the USA in my Chevrolet. America was asking me to call. Still seeing it as a fun adventure here, Matt.
Yeah. It's also very funny, just that one thought where it's like, at any point you could drive across America.
Yeah.
Still a very beautiful country in 2000,
No, this
2010,
is
2024 even.
special America.
Special, it's different.
1950s America. Yeah, different.
Yeah, that's Try driving through the Rockies and tell me that it's changed. Like no, it's the same.
I do want to say, like, we've been critical is the wrong word. I think we've just been very like careful with Jake and his attitude towards this whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that because I disagree that it would be a fun adventure. Like I actually am fully with him on this, that like traveling back to the 1950s would be as like not to, as he says, like not to live, not to spend years there, but just like to go and to experience it. Yeah. I think that would be really cool.
Right. I mean, I think Jake is being foolish in exactly the same way that you and I would be foolish in the situation. Like it's
exactly.
it's an empathizable folly, not like oh my god, this moron, but very, very, a very human kind of folly that
absolutely,
which is good. Yeah, relatable.
So any predictions about where the story goes from here? Obviously we're in the experiment to save Henry Dunning's family, right? In fact, the part 2 that we're going to get to next is titled The Janitor's Father. So we're going to spend at least some time with Jake's adventure through that ordeal. Any guesses on how that goes and how we transition from that to Dallas and John F. Kennedy?
I mean, I don't know that it's that I have anything super smart to say beyond like I think he probably does succeed in stopping the dad from killing the family. It's probably extremely traumatic for him. For some, somehow it goes poorly. And then he comes back to the future and like results are unclear and ambiguous. And like maybe, the family had just a horrible hard time without the father or something of that shape. And this casts into doubt whether he wants to do the JFK thing. But I think maybe this is a separate thought, so I should put a period and a paragraph break here. But I'm like, I think at some point he has to see the JFK assassination as like a personal affront. Like maybe he has something happen when he's back in the past where he comes to understand who JFK is as a man and appreciates him. Not that he meets him, but that he just like understands this guy more than just like, oh, he's a historical figure. Like, the JFK assassination, it was a historical event. It's like, no, JFK will become a guy to him, a man who died, who didn't have to die.
Okay.
And that will be, that will galvanize him to actually begin to care about this. I don't know. Those are two separate thoughts, and I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about where the story is going because I feel like we're still setting things up. I don't know what direction the ball's going to head in yet.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair. Totally fair. Cool. All right. Well, that is it for this week. We will continue next week with chapters 5 and 6. It's a little bit of a smaller reading this week. It's only going to be 50 pages as compared to the, I think, 92 we covered this week. But I wanted us to get through the first part this week. So I stretched our page count a little bit.
I'm glad. I'm actually really glad you did, because this felt like a really clean stopping point, and I think I would have been felt a little frustrated if we had stopped prior to this. So thank you.
Yeah. You're very welcome. All right, so no discussion questions to talk about this week, but we do have one for next week, and I think we're going to get the most obvious one out of the way here at the beginning of the coverage, right, Matt? Let's just do this one, and then we can move on to other stuff. So What is next week's discussion question?
Next week's discussion question is, what is your favorite time travel story?
Oh my goodness. Matt, what is your favorite time travel story? Don't answer. Just think about it and come back to me next week.
Okay.
But yeah, let us know. I think this is there's so many. Gosh, we love talking about time travel in this world. We do.
I know. I have a hard time answering because I can think of several that I love, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let us know and why. What are the elements of it that make it your favorite time travel story?
Yeah.
All right. That's going to do it. Next week, 11/22/63 continues chapters 5 and 6 once again. And we've gotten a few questions about people wanting to know the show schedule. Just going to remind you all that we do have a Excel document linked in the show notes of every episode that has the complete breakdown of the show schedule. It will have every book we're covering, every set of chapters, the date those episodes are going to come out. It's all right there for you. It's easy to see. So if you're ever curious about when I should stop reading or what we're going to be covering when, you can check that out. It's all there.
Yeah. Remember, you can also reach out to us via email at kingslingerspod@gmail.com. You can reach out to us over on Twitter at kingslingerspod, and you can post on the subreddit at reddit.com/r/doofmedia. Check out what's happening over there on the subreddit.
Yeah. You know what else you should do? You should head on over to our merch store. You should go to doofmedia.myshopify.com and check out the Podcast Me mug, which is our best-selling mug. Everybody loves it. It's the greatest thing we've ever done, Matt. It's individually better than every single episode of this podcast we produced.
It's our greatest accomplishment. You're right.
So you should get that mug and also check out all the other cool stuff there. There's, I think we're heading into the springtime now. So beanies and sweaters, not so much, but there's t-shirts, there's mugs, there's glasses, there's buttons, there's stickers. There's we should get one that's just our faces. You should just wear our faces.
That's right. It's an embarrassment of riches, though. Go check it out.
Yeah, please do.
And if you would like to support us, then please consider donating to our Patreon over at patreon.com/doofmedia.
But as always, if you cannot afford to donate right now, that is absolutely okay. You can always help us out by sharing this podcast. We are on a new book. It's a very popular book. People really like this book. And maybe they want to listen to people talk about this book for, let's see how many episodes, 2.5 hours, for 38 hours. So share the podcast. And please keep sending those ratings and reviews in. We haven't had a new one to read in a couple weeks now, and I miss them. I miss your wonderful words. So if you, for whatever reason, haven't sent a review in yet, please do so. They really do help us. Seriously, please keep them going. And also, it just makes us feel good that we're doing something y'all like.
Yeah, and that's all that matters.
It is all that matters. All right, folks, y'all have a good week. We'll see you back here next week for more 11/22/63. Long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.